She kept it in a drawer beside her bed, a small glass tube, sealed, holding a salt that glowed on its own, a soft, blue-green light that needed no flame, no battery, no sun. Visitors said she liked to open the drawer at night and look at it. She called it, in a letter to her sister, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. That light was killing her, and she was the one person on earth who was in a position to know it. Here is the part that I can't get past. Marie Curie did not die of ignorance. That's the version we tell. The sweet, tragic scientist who simply didn't understand what she was handling. But by 1925, 9 years before her death, she was sitting on a French medical commission and amending lead screens and routine blood tests for anyone working with radioactive material. She wrote the safety rules. She enforced them on her staff. She did not apply them to herself. So this isn't a story about a woman who didn't know. It's a story about a woman who knew. And about the 10 or so moments where somebody, a parent, a university, a committee, a newspaper, a government, or Marie herself, pushed a door shut that could have changed how this ended. Some of those doors, if they had stayed open, would have saved her life, and at least one of them, if it had stayed open, would have erased her from history entirely. Let's walk through all of them. To understand what she survived, you have to start with what she was. She was born Maria Salomia Skodowska in Warsaw on the 7th of November, 1867. And I want to be precise about the place, because the textbooks flatten it. Warsaw in 1867 was not the capital of a country. Poland, as a state, did not exist. What existed was Congress Poland, a shell of a polity swallowed by the Russian Empire, where the Russian language was pushed into schools, where Polish history was taught as a footnote, and where a child could be interrogated by a school inspector for reciting the wrong list of Tsars. Her parents were both teachers. That mattered. But so did this. The Skodowski family had been landowners once, and they had lost nearly everything because their relatives had thrown themselves into failed uprisings against Russian rule. Rebellion ran in the blood, and so did the price of it. Maria grew up in a house that was educated and proud and quietly broke. Then her father was stripped of his post and banned from running laboratory instruction in Polish schools. The Russian administration didn't want Polish boys doing experiments. So Władysław Skodowski did the only thing a teacher can do when the state closes the classroom. He carried the equipment home, the glass tubes, the scales, the electroscope, and set it up in the apartment, and let his children touch it. Sit with that for a second. The single most consequential physicist of the 20th century, her first laboratory, because an empire tried to take one away. She graduated at 15, first in her class, with a gold medal, and then she collapsed. The family called it a nervous illness. The records are gentle about it. The way families are. Read the description today. The withdrawal, the exhaustion, the inability to work for a year. And most clinicians would recognize it as a depressive episode. She was sent to the countryside to relatives, and she stayed there for a year, and she came back. But when she came back to Warsaw wanting a university, there wasn't one that would take her, not because of her grades, because she was a woman. So she went underground, literally. She enrolled in what Warsaw called the Flying University, an illegal, itinerant, patriotic institution that held classes in private apartments, moved locations to stay ahead of the Tsarist police, taught in Polish, and admitted women. That is where Maria Skodowska got her higher education, in rooms that changed address to avoid arrest. And then she made a deal with her older sister Bronisława that I think is one of the most quietly heroic bargains in the history of science. There was money for one of them to study in Paris, not two, so Maria said, "You go first, I'll work, I'll send you money, and when you're a doctor, you send for me." She took a job as a governess in the Polish countryside, with a wealthy family named Kurowski, relatives of her father, and there she fell in love with their eldest son, Kazimierz, a brilliant young man who would go on to become a serious mathematician. They wanted to marry. His parents refused. Flatly. Immediately. Not because they disliked her. By every account they liked her enormously, because she was poor, because a governess was not what you marry when you are the Grafskys. Kazimierz did not fight them. He obeyed his parents, and the engagement ended. Here's what I think. That refusal was the cruelest thing that ever happened to the young Maria Skłodowska, and it was also the single luckiest event in the history of modern physics. If those parents had said yes, she becomes Maria Skłodowska, wife of a Krakow professor, in a country that had already told her twice that its universities were not for her. There is no Paris. There is no shed on the Rue Lomond. There is, in all likelihood, no polonium and no radium with her name on them. She responded to the heartbreak the way she would respond to every catastrophe for the rest of her life. She buried herself in textbooks. There's a coda to this one, and I want to flag it honestly. It's the kind of story that circulates widely and is hard to nail to a primary source. It's said that decades later, after a statue of Maria Skłodowska Curie was unveiled in Warsaw in 1935, an elderly Kazimierz Kurowski, by then a distinguished professor, a rector, a man with a full life behind him, would sit on a bench in front of it for a long time, not saying anything. I can't prove that happened, but it is the shape of the truth about that door. It closed on both of them in 1891. At 24, she finally got her turn. What she found in Paris was not romance. It was a garret near the Sorbonne, unheated, because coal cost money and physics books cost money, and she had made a choice. In winter she piled every piece of clothing she owned on the bed and, when that failed, put a chair on top of the pile for the weight of it, so the fabric would press down and hold the heat. She sometimes forgot to eat. She fainted at least once from hunger. I want to be careful not to romanticize this. We tell these stories like they're inspiring. They're not inspiring. They're the cost of admission that was charged to her and not to the men beside her in the lecture hall. She earned a degree in physics in 1893, first in her class, a degree in mathematics the following year, second, and through a Polish acquaintance looking for lab space, she met a shy, serious, 35-year-old physicist named Pierre Curie, who had spent his career being quietly overlooked by the French scientific establishment and who fell in love with her almost immediately. He proposed. She said no, because she was going home. That was the entire plan, and had been for a decade. Paris was the training, Poland was the point. So in the summer of 1894, she went back to Warsaw, and she applied for a position at Krakow University, and Krakow turned her down. She was a woman. Read that again. In 1894, the country she had starved for, the country she had gone underground to study for, the country she was preparing to spend her life serving, closed its laboratory door in her face for the same reason Warsaw had 8 years earlier. Pierre wrote to her. His letters from this period are, honestly, some of the most disarming things in the archive. A man who cannot flirt, trying very hard to flirt, mostly by talking about magnetism. He told her he would come to Poland if she insisted. He would learn Polish. He would teach French for a living. He would give up his own work. And then he made the argument that actually landed. That France was the only place on earth where her talent had a room to grow in. He was right. That is the tragedy of Door 2. He was right. She came back. They married on the 26th of July, 1895, in a civil ceremony. No church, no white dress. She wore a dark blue outfit instead. And here is the detail that tells you everything about her. She then wore that same dress in the laboratory 4 years afterward, because dark blue was practical and didn't show the chemical stains. A wedding dress that became lab equipment. That's the woman. They spent their honeymoon on bicycles. And if Krakow had said yes, I think the honest answer is that radium is still discovered. The physics was in the air. Becquerel had already seen the rays. But it is discovered later by someone else, probably by a team with a patent lawyer, which brings us to the door that mattered most. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen announced X-rays. In 1896, Henry Becquerel noticed that uranium salts formed a photographic plate in a dark drawer, all by themselves, with no sunlight involved. Almost nobody followed up on Becquerel. It looked like a curiosity. Marie Curie chose it for her doctoral thesis, which is the single best call anyone made in physics that decade. And then she did something that was not obvious at all. She didn't just confirm the effect, she measured it, using an instrument Pierre and his brother had built, a device sensitive enough to quantify the tiny electrical currents the rays produced in air. And when she ran uranium ore, pitch blend, through it, the numbers came back wrong. The ore was more active than the uranium inside it could account for. Most people would have checked their instrument. She checked her assumption, and she concluded that there had to be something else in there, something new, something present in quantities so small that nobody had ever seen it, but so ferociously energetic that it was drowning out the uranium. She was right twice. In July of 1898, she and Pierre announced polonium, named, deliberately and provocatively, for a country that did not appear on any map of Europe. She wanted the name of Poland printed in the scientific journals of the world. That was a political act disguised as chemistry. In December of 1898, they announced radium, but announcing it and proving it are different things, and the proof is where the story turns dark. To convince the skeptics, they had to isolate enough pure radium to weigh it and take its spectrum. That meant processing pitchblende residue by the ton, hauling sacks of it, dissolving it, boiling it, crystallizing it, over and over, thousands of times. Where did they do this? In a shed, an abandoned dissection room in the courtyard of the school where Pierre taught, with a glass roof that leaked, no floor to speak of, no ventilation, no fume hood. The German chemist Wilhelm Ostwald, who came to see it after they'd become famous, said it looked like a cross between a stable and a potato cellar, and when he was told this was the laboratory, he assumed someone was playing a joke on him. It froze in winter. It baked in summer. In warm weather, they moved the chemistry outside into the yard, because the fumes had nowhere else to go. For nearly 4 years, Marie Curie stirred boiling vats of radioactive material with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was, in an unventilated shed, breathing radon gas, and she wrote later that they loved that miserable place. At night, they would come back and stand in the dark and look at the shelves, where the tubes and dishes of concentrated material glowed faintly blue in the black. She described those glimmering outlines as fairy lights. From tons of ore, they extracted about 1/10 of a gram of radium chloride. Here is door 3, and it is the door that actually kills her. 35 years later, in a French sanatorium, a ventilation hood, a lead screen, gloves, a rule that says, you do not eat in the room where you boil radioactive residues. None of that existed for them, because nobody in 1898 knew it needed to, and because the Curies were working in a building that had been condemned for teaching medical students. And here's what gets me about it. The French university system had money. It had proper laboratories. It gave the Curies the shed, because Pierre was not politically connected, and Marie was a Polish woman, and neither of them was good at asking. When their work made radium the most valuable substance on Earth by weight, they were still in that shed. If someone at the Sorbonne had walked out to that courtyard in 1899 and said, we're moving you into a real building, I think Marie Curie lives another 20 years. Nobody walked out. There was a second way out of that shed, and it fit on one sheet of paper. By 1902, radium had gone from a laboratory curiosity to a medical phenomenon. Doctors discovered that it burned tumors. An entire industry began to assemble itself, almost overnight, around a substance that only 2 people in the world knew how to purify at scale. Pierre and Marie held that knowledge. They could have patented the extraction process. Their friends told them to. It would have made them, conservatively, one of the wealthiest scientific households in Europe. They sat down, they talked about it, and they said no. Marie's reasoning was that it was contrary to the scientific spirit, that if radium had a future in medicine, it could not belong to anyone. She said the process belonged to the world. I want to give this decision the weight it deserves. And I want to be a little bit contrarian about it too. Morally, it's magnificent. Because they refused, radium therapy spread. Because they refused, the Curie Institute and every institution modeled on it could work without licensing fees. That decision is one of the reasons radiation oncology exists as a public medicine rather than a private monopoly. But strategically, and this is my honest read, it was a catastrophe for her own survival. That patent would have bought a laboratory with ventilation. It would have bought lead. It would have bought assistance, so that the woman handling the material with her bare hands for 4 years didn't have to be her. She spent the next decade begging institutions and philanthropists for equipment she could have simply purchased, and the industry that grew up in the vacuum they left was not careful. Within 20 years, you could buy radium toothpaste, radium face cream, radium suppositories, which I promise you are not making up. You could buy a jug that made your drinking water radioactive at home. An American socialite named Eben Byers drank a patent medicine, Raditha by the case, and died in 1932 with his jaw disintegrating. Young women in New Jersey and Illinois painted glow-in-the-dark watch dials and were taught to point the brushes with their lips, and they died of it, and they had to sue for the right to be believed. None of that is Marie Curie's fault, but it is the world that existed on the other side of the door she declined to close. The Curies got nothing from the radium boom, not a franc. In 1903, the French Academy of Sciences submitted its nominations to Stockholm for the Nobel Prize in Physics. They put forward two names for the work on radioactivity: Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie, not Marie, the woman whose thesis it was, the woman who had done the measurements, made the inference, named the field. She coined the word radioactivity and hauled the pitchblende, left off the list, by her own colleagues in her own city. She almost never found out. What saved her was a Swedish mathematician on the committee, Magnus Gege de Metoclafler, who had known and supported women in science his whole career, and who did something slightly improper. He wrote privately to Pierre and told him what was happening. Pierre wrote back on the 6th of August, 1903, and his answer is one of the reasons I have such affection for this awkward gentleman. He said, in effect, if this is a serious consideration of our work on radioactive bodies, then I wish to be considered jointly with Madame Curie. Her research led to the discovery of the new elements. Her role in it was major. The committee found a workaround. A 1902 nomination that had included her name was pulled forward and validated for 1903. In December 1903, the prize went to Becquerel and to both Curies. Marie Curie became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize. And I want to be blunt about the counterfactual here, because it's not soft. If Metoclafler keeps his mouth shut, if he decides it's not his business, Marie Curie is not the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She's a footnote in her husband's citation. The entire 20th century story of women in science loses its founding data point. One private letter. That's the whole margin. Neither of them went to Stockholm to collect it. Incidentally, they were too ill and too exhausted to travel. They didn't give the Nobel lecture for another year and a half. Too ill? In 1903. Remember that. The 19th of April, 1906. A Thursday, raining. Pierre Curie had spent the morning at a lunch with the Association of Science faculty. He left, walked toward the Seine, and stepped into the Rue Dauphine, a narrow street, crowded with traffic, behind a cab, into the path of a heavy horse-drawn wagon. He was struck. He went under. A rear wheel passed over his skull. He died instantly. At 46, Marie was not in Paris. She came home to be told at the door what she wrote afterward. In a private journal she addressed directly to him, is almost unbearable to read. Descriptions of the fluid on his face, of kissing his forehead, of the world becoming a thing she moved through without feeling. Now, this is the point where I have to be careful, because there is a version of this story that gets told with more confidence than the evidence supports. The version goes, radium killed Pierre Curie too, that he was so damaged by his own experiments and he had famously strapped radium to his own arm to observe the burn it left. That by 1906 he was in constant pain, unsteady on his feet, sometimes unable to dress himself, that he was walking into traffic on legs that no longer entirely worked. Here's where I land. The first half of that is documented. Pierre Curie was sick, and both Curies attributed the exhaustion, the pain in the limbs, and the general decline to overwork, though the record makes it fairly clear that they were both suffering from chronic radiation exposure. His hands were damaged. He was in poor condition. The second half, that his illness is what put him under the wheel, is inference, not evidence. Nobody knows what he was thinking in the second before he stepped out. Paris streets in 1906 killed pedestrians who were in perfect health. The rain alone is enough of an explanation. So I'll put it the way I think it should be put. It is possible that radium killed Pierre Curie twice, and we can only be certain about the slow way. That's an open question, and it should stay open. What is not in question is what's happened next, and it is grotesque in its own quiet way. The Sorbonne offered Marie his chair. She became the first woman to teach at the University of Paris in its 650-year history. When she gave her first lecture that November, the hall was packed with press and gawkers waiting for an emotional scene. She walked in and began the lecture at the exact sentence where Pierre had stopped. No preamble, no tribute. She picked up his last sentence and continued. The door that closed on the Rue Dauphine gave her the professorship. She would have traded it in a heartbeat, and everyone in that room knew it. By late 1910, she had done something extraordinary and thankless. She had isolated radium as a pure metal, closing the last loophole any skeptic could point at. So she stood for election to the French Academy of Sciences. 1 seat. Her opponent was Edouard Branly, 66 years old, a physicist whose work on wireless telegraphy was real and who had been passed over when Marconi took the 1909 Nobel, which made him, in the eyes of a certain kind of French patriot, a wrong national hero. And that is when the French press turned on Marie Curie for the first time. Branly was championed by conservative Catholic France. He had been honored by the Pope. Curie was a freethinker, a foreigner, and a woman. The right-wing papers ran a campaign against her, and part of that campaign was a rumor with no basis in fact at all, that she was Jewish. She wasn't. She'd been raised Catholic and had left religion behind after her mother's death. It didn't matter. The rumor wasn't information. It was a weapon. The vote was held on the 23rd of January, 1911. Branly won by 2 votes, 2. She never stood for the Academy again. Her response, which by now you can predict, was to go back to the laboratory and work. And the reason this door matters is not wounded pride. It's this. The Academy campaign is where the French press learned that Marie Curie was attackable. It established a vocabulary, foreign and womanly, a threat, and it taught the editors that stories about her sold papers. They had 10 months to sharpen the knife before they got to use it properly. Paul Langevin had been Pierre's student. He was brilliant. He was gentle. He was 5 years younger than Marie, and he was trapped in a marriage that had become genuinely ugly. His wife's family openly contemptuous of a man who turned down lucrative industrial work to stay in research. And there are accounts of physical violence in that household. Sometime after Pierre's death, Marie Curie and Paul Langevin fell in love. He rented an apartment. They wrote to each other. In the summer of 1911, Langevin's wife obtained those letters. The accounts differ on exactly how, and some of what eventually reached print may have been altered or fabricated from the originals, and handed them to the press. The timing was surgical. In the autumn of 1911, Curie was in Brussels at the first Solvay conference, sitting in a room with Einstein, Planck, Rutherford, and Poincare, arguing about quantum theory. She was, at that precise moment, at the absolute summit of her professional life. While she was there, the Paris papers detonated the story. She was called a foreign Jewish homewrecker. Again, the Jewish claim was invented, and it was invented specifically because anti-Semitic France of the Dreyfus era knew what to do with it. She was called a seducer of a younger man, and the ugliest lie of all, several papers hinted that the affair had begun while Pierre was alive, and that Pierre had walked in front of that wagon on purpose. Then she came home to sew. There was a mob outside her house. A crowd gathered on her street, shouting. Inside were her two daughters. Irene was 14. Eve was 7. Let that be the image you keep, not the laboratory, not the Nobel medal. A 14-year-old and a 7-year-old standing in a house with a crowd outside, waiting to see what a crowd like that decides to do. Nobody knows what would have happened if they had come through the door, because Marie got her daughters out and took refuge with friends in Paris. Langevin fought a duel with the editor of one of the papers. Pistols, at dawn, at a velodrome. Neither man fired. It was, in the words of the American Institute of Physics exhibit on her life, an emotional but bloodless affair of honor. Albert Einstein wrote to her. He told her not to read the garbage, that it was manufactured for the reptiles who enjoyed it, and that if the rabble continued to occupy itself with her, she should simply stop reading it. He also wrote to another colleague that he admired her, but that her mind wasn't built for it. She wasn't the type to do damage to anyone. And then, in the middle of all of it, the second Nobel Prize was announced, Chemistry, 1911, for the discovery of polonium and radium and the isolation of pure radium metal. She was now the first person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes, and the only person ever to win in 2 different sciences, a record that, over a century later, still stands alone. And a member of the Nobel Committee, the chemist Svante Arrhenius, wrote to tell her not to come to Stockholm, to wait until her name was cleared, to decline. For now, her reply is the single best thing she ever wrote. And I mean that. She told him the prize had been awarded for the discovery of radium and polonium, and that she believed there was no connection between her scientific work and the facts of her private life. Then she got on the train and went to Stockholm and collected it. Here's what I think. That letter is the closest thing modern science has to a founding document on the separation of a person's work from a person's life, and it was written by a woman under conditions that would have flattened almost anyone. She was not being defiant for the cameras. She was making a technical point, coldly. To a committee of technicians, you were not qualified to evaluate my bedroom, and my bedroom did not isolate radium. The door here is the one the press closed, because after Stockholm, she broke. A month after the ceremony, she collapsed. Kidney disease, real, physical, requiring surgery, combined with a depression so severe that she was hospitalized. She checked into a private clinic under a false name. In March 1912, she had the kidney operation. She then spent months in seclusion, in a house rented under the name Skokodowska, hiding from journalists who were still hunting her. In the summer, she went to England, still under her maiden name, and stayed on the Dorset coast with her friend Hertha Orietung, herself a physicist, herself a widow of a physicist, herself repeatedly denied the recognition she'd earned. Local accounts of her stay describe a woman who barely went out. One description of her from that period has stayed with me, like a beast at bay. Marie Curie's laboratory notebooks are among the most complete scientific records of the era. Between the autumn of 1911 and the 3rd of December, 1912, there is nothing in them. 14 months of silence from the most productive scientist in France. Now, here is why I count this as a door rather than just an injury. In those 14 months, she was not being poisoned. She was in bed, in England, in a rented house, away from radium. It is the only sustained break from exposure in her adult working life. Her body got over a year to try to repair itself, and it is, I would argue, one of the reasons she lasted until 1934 instead of dying in the 1920s. The French press hounded her out of her laboratory, and by hounding her out of her laboratory, they may have accidentally bought her a decade. I don't know what to do with that. I just know it's true. She came back on the 3rd of December, 1912, and wrote in the notebook again, and picked up where she had stopped, which is, if you've been paying attention, Exactly what she had done in Pierre's lecture hall 6 years earlier. It's the only move she has. When the world hits her, she returns to the sentence she was in the middle of. August 1914. Germany invades. The front line comes within 40 miles of Paris. Marie Curie was 56 years old, a two-time Nobel laureate, and had just been given, finally, after 15 years, the Radium Institute, a purpose-built laboratory with actual funding. It was finished the month the war started. The staff left for the army. The building sat empty. What she did next is the part of her life I'd argue is the most underrated. She worked out, correctly, and before the French military medical service did, that the single biggest survivable killer on that front was surgeons operating blind, shrapnel and bullets that couldn't be located. So surgeons had to go digging, and infection did the rest. X-rays could find the fragment in minutes, but X-ray machines were in city hospitals, and the wounded were in field stations 200 miles away, and men were dying in transit. So she reversed it. She built vehicles. She begged cars off wealthy women, stripped them, installed an X-ray tube, a photographic darkroom, and a dynamo driven by the car's own engine, so the unit could generate its own electricity in a field with no power grid. 20 of these vehicles went out. The soldiers named them the Petites Curies, the Little Curies. She also oversaw the installation of some 200 fixed radiological rooms at field hospitals behind the lines. She trained 150 women as radiological technicians, women who had never seen a laboratory, teaching them electricity, anatomy, and photographic processing. She learned to drive so she could take a unit to the front herself. She learned basic auto mechanics so she could fix it when it broke down on a shelled road. Her daughter Irene, 17 years old, worked the units alongside her. Estimates of how many wounded men passed through the radiology service she built run to around 1 million. She also tried to donate her Nobel medals to the French war effort. They were gold, and gold was what the treasury needed. The bank politely refused to melt down the medals of Marie Curie, so she took the prize money instead and put all of it into war bonds, which the French state later defaulted on, meaning she effectively gave the money away. And now the hard part. The X-ray equipment of 1915 had essentially no shielding. Operators stood in the beam scatter, hour after hour, in a canvas tent. Marie Curie spent 4 years doing this. She also handled radon gas. She collected it from her own radium supply and sealed it into glass needles for treating the wounded, which meant repeated close contact with a radioactive gas in a badly ventilated room. She knew, by then, that radiation burned tissue. Everyone in the field knew. She had watched Pierre burn his own arm to prove it. She did it anyway, because there were men bleeding out in Verdun with metal in them that nobody could see. That is not ignorance. That is a decision. And I think it's the only door in this entire story that she closed on herself deliberately, with her eyes open, for a reason she considered worth it. Whether it was the thing that finally killed her is, as we'll see, still argued about. Let's kill the comfortable version of this story. The comfortable version says Marie Curie was an innocent, that she and Pierre played with glowing tubes like children with fireflies, because no one on Earth understood what ionizing radiation did to a human body. It's a nice story because it removes the blame. It's also wrong. Here's the record. By the early 1900s, radium burns were well documented. Pierre had deliberately produced one on his own arm. By the 1920s, the evidence was overwhelming and public. The dial painters in America, the death of Eben bias, the medical literature piling up, and Marie Curie responded to that evidence. In 1925, she sat on a commission of the French Academy of Medicine that recommended lead screens and periodic blood testing for workers handling radioactive materials in industrial laboratories. At her own institute, she instituted blood tests for her staff. She told her researchers to get outside, to get fresh air, to not work themselves to death in a sealed room. She wrote the safety culture for everyone else. She herself carried tubes of radium in her coat pocket. She kept samples in her desk drawer. She worked, for decades, without the shielding she was recommending to other people's employees. and she would not accept, publicly, that her own body was the evidence. From 1920 onward, she developed cataracts in both eyes, a classic radiation injury, and needed 4 operations to see well enough to work. Her hearing failed. Her fingertips were cracked and scarred, and permanently numb from handling the material. She attributed all of it to age and overwork, and when she was asked about radium's dangers, she tended to answer as an advocate, not as a patient. So the myth to correct is not that she didn't know, it's the opposite. And it's harder to look at, she knew, and she made an exception for herself. Here's what I think is really going on, and it's not stupidity. She was not stupid about anything. It's that admitting radium was destroying her would have handed a weapon to every enemy she had. To the academy that rejected her by 2 votes, to the papers that put a mob outside her daughter's house, to the industry that wanted to sell radium tonic, Marie Curie had spent 30 years being told her work was illegitimate. Standing up and saying my work is poisoning me was, I suspect, a sentence she could not physically form. Denial is not always ignorance. Sometimes it's armor, and in her case, I think it was armor that she'd needed so badly, for so long, that she couldn't take it off even when it started killing her. She died on the 4th of July, 1934, at a sanatorium at Saint-Chelemos, in the French Alps, at 66. The diagnosis, aplastic anemia, bone marrow failure. The factory that makes blood cells simply stops. Her physicians recorded that her marrow had not reacted, probably because it had been injured by long accumulation of radiation. That much is settled. The cause was radiation. Aplastic anemia, in a woman who spent 35 years in the field, is not a coincidence, and nobody serious argues otherwise. But here's the part that is genuinely open, and I want to present both sides fairly, because you will see this stated with far too much confidence on the internet. Theory 1. The radium. 35 years of handling radium salts by hand. Breathing radon in an unventilated shed for 4 years. Carrying samples in her pocket. Sleeping near a glowing tube. Radium is a bone seeker. Chemically it behaves like calcium, so the body files it in the skeleton, directly adjacent to the marrow, where it sits and irradiates for the rest of your life. This is exactly the mechanism that killed the radium dial painters. It fits. Theory 2. The war. 4 years of standing beside unshielded X-ray tubes in field hospitals, in 1915-era equipment, at doses nobody was measuring. Hard external X-rays deliver whole-body exposure that hits marrow across the entire skeleton at once. Some of her own family and later commentators have leaned toward this, the argument being that the wartime work delivered a larger total dose in a shorter period than the laboratory ever did. And then there's the piece of physical evidence that keeps this case open. In 1995, when the French state moved her remains to the Pantheon, her coffin was opened. It was lined with about 2.5 millimeters of lead, and the contamination measured on the remains was, by the accounts published at the time, smaller than people expected. Some read that as pointing away from a massive internal radium burden and toward external X-ray exposure as the dominant factor. But I want to give the counter-argument its full weight. Because it's strong, 61 years had passed. Radium-226 has a half-life of about 1600 years, so it doesn't simply decay away. But measurement conditions at an exhumation are not laboratory conditions. The survey was not a controlled forensic study, and reports of it are second-hand and inconsistent. You cannot build a firm conclusion on it. Where I land, I don't think it's either or, and I think demanding a single culprit is the wrong question. Marie Curie absorbed radiation from at least 4 distinct sources across 4 decades. The pitchblende processing, the radon in the shed, the samples she kept on her person, and the wartime X-ray work. Any 2 of those would have been enough. Asking which one killed her is like asking which cigarette caused the cancer. But if you forced me to pick the door that mattered most, I would not pick the war. I would pick the shed, because the war exposure was a choice she made as an adult, knowing the risk for a reason. The shed was 4 years of unprotected, and ventilated. Around-the-clock exposure that happened because the richest scientific establishment in Europe couldn't be bothered to give a Polish woman a room with a window that opened. That one wasn't fate. That was budget. Her possessions outlived her, and they are still dangerous. Her laboratory notebooks, the actual paper, in her actual handwriting, the pages where she wrote down the numbers that founded a branch of physics, are contaminated with radium-226, half-life, about 1600 years. They are held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in lead-lined boxes. A researcher who wants to read them signs a liability waiver and wears protective clothing. Her cookbook is radioactive, her furniture, her clothes. Think about what that means for a second. The most intimate objects of a person's life, her handwriting, her recipes, the chair she sat in, sealed away from human touch, and they will still be too hot to handle when everyone watching this video has been dead for 15 centuries. That is the most literal legacy in the history of science. She's still in the room. So let's put the doors back to back, because the pattern is the point. A family says no to a poor governess. A Krakow university says no to a woman. The Sorbonne gives two of the greatest experimentalists alive a leaking shed and calls it a laboratory. The Curies refuse a patent that would have bought them safety, and the world gets radium therapy and radium toothpaste in the same bargain. The French Academy leaves her off a Nobel nomination, and a Swedish mathematician has to leak it. A wagon in the rain, 2 votes, a mob outside a house with 2 little girls in it, 14 silent months, and then a war she volunteered for, with a machine she knew was hurting her. Not one of those was fate. Every single one was a decision made by a person, or a committee of persons, most of whom were not remembered, and did not think they were doing anything historic. That's the thing about near misses. They're never dramatic in the moment. To vote is a Monday afternoon. Here's what I think, and it's the thesis of this whole video. We have built a myth around Marie Curie that is actually a way of not taking responsibility. The myth says she was a martyr to science. The radium was the price of the discovery. It was beautiful and sad and inevitable. It was not inevitable. Take any two of the following. A ventilated laboratory in 1898, the patent income, a professorship offered at 30 instead of at 38, an academy seat that gave her institutional cover, a press that left her alone in 1911, and Marie Skłodowska-Curie plausibly lives into the 1950s. She would have been in her 80s. She would have seen her daughter Irene win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935. She missed it by less than a year. Irene and her husband Frederick announced artificial radioactivity in January 1934. Marie was alive for the discovery and held the first samples in her hands. -1 month before she died. She did not live to see it honored, and she would have been alive to say something about what was done with her elements in the 1940s. What Marie Curie would have said about the bomb is one of the great unanswerable questions of the century, and the reason it's unanswerable is that she died 11 years too early. The way I see it, her life is not a story about the cost of genius. It's a story about how much a system will extract from someone before it gives them a safe place to work, and how, by the time it finally builds them a proper laboratory, the damage is already in the bone. She got the Radium Institute in 1914. The marrow damage was done by 1906. That's the whole tragedy in 2 dates. In 1995, 61 years after her death, the French Republic moved Marie and Pierre Curie into the Pantheon in Paris, the tomb reserved for the nation's greatest. She was the first woman placed there for her own achievements, rather than for who she was married to. Poland claimed her first, though. She never stopped being Polish. She named an element after a country that didn't exist. She built a second Radium Institute in Warsaw and had her sister Bronisława, the sister she'd once worked as a governess to support, run it. Both institutes are still functioning cancer research centers today. Everything she made outlived her. She was asked once, near the end of her life, about fear, about whether the work frightened her. What she said was this: Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less. She was wrong about one thing in that sentence. There was something in her life to be feared, and she had understood it better than anyone alive, and she kept it in a drawer beside her bed, because it was beautiful. 10 doors, every one of them closed by a human hand, and she walked through the wall anyway. If this one got to you, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about getting history right. Subscribe for more Near Miss History, where we look at the moment things almost went a different way. And if you want to see what happened to the industry that grew out of her discovery, the watch dials, the tonics, and the young women who had to sue for the right to be believed, that story is on screen now. Thanks for watching.